The night had the kind of sheen that only New York City seemed capable of producing. An effortless mix of steel, glass, and gold. The Ellison Corporate Gala was a yearly spectacle, a place where deals were sealed with handshakes under crystal chandeliers and laughter spilled from wine glasses that cost more than a week's wages for most of the city. Beneath the towering glass walls of the Metropolitan Skyline Ballroom, the city lights twinkled like a million unblinking eyes, watching the rich and powerful in their natural habitat. At the center of it all was Margaret Ellison, tall, poised, her gown a shimmering cascade of silver silk that caught every camera flash. She moved through the crowd like a queen in her court, her smile sharp as the diamond choker at her throat. People didn't just greet her. They sought her approval. Every glance, every handshake was part of an unspoken hierarchy she maintained without effort. Across the polished marble floor, almost invisible to the swirl of tuxedos and couture dresses, was James Porter. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet ease of someone who had learned the art of not being noticed. His janitor's uniform was neatly pressed, his shoes clean but well worn. In one hand, he held a mop handle. In the other, a rag folded with military precision. His dark skin gleamed under the soft glow of the chandeliers, but no one looked twice. To most, he was part of the background, a fixture no more remarkable than the marble itself. The grand piano, a Steinway, polished to a black mirror finish, sat near the stage, a silent centerpiece of the room. Guests occasionally leaned against it while talking, tapping its keys in idle curiosity, but it had yet to be played. It was more a statement piece than an instrument tonight. Margaret, flanked by two board members, noticed James across the room. Something in her gaze shifted, a calculating flicker, the kind she used when deciding how to turn an ordinary moment into a performance. She excused herself from her companions and glided toward the piano, stopping just short of James. He didn't flinch when she addressed him. He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, as she let her words fall into the air like a challenge dressed as a joke. She spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear, for the whispers to ripple outward like a slow-moving wave. The room didn't stop entirely, but it slowed. Conversations thinned to murmurs. A few chuckles rose, the kind meant to side with the powerful. Others simply shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the janitor and the CEO as though watching an unfamiliar game with cruel rules. James's gaze didn't waver. He set the mop aside with deliberate care, his hands steady. Without a word, he began walking toward the piano. The murmurs thickened. A waiter carrying champagne stopped mid-stride, glasses trembling slightly on the tray. Margaret's daughter, Claire, watched from across the room. At 28, she carried the understated elegance of someone who cared little for the spotlight. Her long dark hair was swept into a low twist, her gown simple but refined. She'd seen James countless times in the building where her mother's company held its offices. He was always polite, his "Good morning, Miss Ellison," delivered with the kind of sincerity that left no room for pity. And now, she felt her stomach knotting. Claire didn't know why her mother had singled him out, but she knew this was more than a joke. This was a test, one with stakes only her mother truly understood. James reached the bench. He rested his hands on the lid, fingers spread as if feeling the grain of the polished wood. The air seemed to tighten, every sound in the room muted except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls. When he finally sat down, there was no hesitation, no preamble. His hands hovered above the keys for a heartbeat. Then the first note fell into the air. It wasn't yet the full piece, just a single sound, rich and resonant, like the clearing of a throat before a story begins. And the story was about to begin. The first full chord poured into the room like honey over glass, slow and warm, yet carrying a weight that made the air feel denser. Conversations dissolved into stillness. Waiters paused mid-step, trays balanced in their hands, eyes drawn involuntarily to the man at the piano. The city lights outside seemed to shimmer differently, as if they too had leaned closer to listen. James's posture was unhurried, but his hands moved with an elegance that spoke of discipline forged over years. His fingers glided over the keys as if they had been there all along, waiting for this exact moment. The sound was unmistakable. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. But it wasn't just a recital. Each note was shaped with an intimacy that suggested the music was not merely learned, but lived. Margaret's smirk didn't vanish entirely, but it faltered. She rested a manicured hand on the back of a chair, as if to anchor herself. This was not the hesitant fumbling of a man grasping at an impossible challenge. This was mastery. Claire felt her chest tighten. She knew the piece. She'd practiced it for years under the careful, exacting guidance of her conservatory instructors. She also knew how deceptively difficult it was, but here was James, in his janitor's uniform, coaxing from the piano not only precision but a tenderness that seemed to reach into every corner of the ballroom. The melody swelled, soft yet insistent, and Claire noticed the subtle changes in the faces around her. The chuckles had died completely. Eyes that moments ago had carried amusement or dismissal now held something else, curiosity, and in some, an uncomfortable kind of awe. James didn't look at the audience. His gaze stayed on the keys, his head tilted slightly toward the sound, like a craftsman listening to the whisper of his own creation. His hands were a study in contrasts, strong, calloused from years of physical work, yet moving with the delicate precision of a jeweler setting a gem. Halfway through the piece, he leaned slightly into a passage, his shoulders drawing closer to the keyboard, the tempo tightening just for a breath before releasing into the nocturne's lush main theme again. The tension and release rippled through the listeners. Someone near the front exhaled audibly, as if they'd been holding their breath. By the final measures, there was no sound except the piano. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. James slowed, letting each note linger a fraction longer than the sheet music demanded, milking its resonance until the final chord hung in the air, trembling against the silence. He didn't rise immediately. His hands stayed poised over the keys, the muscles in his forearms relaxing slowly. When he did stand, he did so without looking at Margaret, without seeking approval or applause. He simply stepped away, as if the performance had been a private conversation between him and the instrument, and the audience had only happened to overhear. The room remained still for a heartbeat longer, as though unwilling to break whatever fragile thread had just been spun. Then, softly, from somewhere near the back, came the first clap. It was hesitant, almost apologetic. Others followed, scattered at first, then building, until the ballroom was filled with applause. Margaret didn't clap. Her eyes stayed fixed on James, searching for something, control perhaps, or a way to reframe the moment in her favor. But the balance in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Claire, still rooted to the same spot, realized her hands were trembling. The performance hadn't just been beautiful, it had been humbling. The revelation. The applause swelled, then faded into murmurs as James quietly stepped away from the piano. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply retrieved the mop he had set aside as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The room seemed unsure how to react. A collective pause in which wealth and status had, for a moment, been irrelevant. Claire moved before she had fully decided to. She threaded through clusters of guests, ignoring the curious looks from acquaintances, until she reached him near the far wall where the marble gleamed under soft light. "You," she began, then caught herself. The word felt too small. She tried again, softer. "That was extraordinary." James offered a polite nod, his eyes calm but distant. "Just an old habit," he said, as if dismissing the idea that anyone should think too much of it. Then he turned slightly, spotting a champagne spill on the floor, and began mopping with the same quiet precision he had played with moments ago. Claire wanted to press him, but before she could, one of her mother's board members approached with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Where did you learn to play like that?" the man asked. James gave the same answer he seemed to have given 100 times before. "A long time ago." His tone was final, and the board member drifted away, unsatisfied. But not everyone left it alone. Word began to move through the gala like a current. That the janitor wasn't just good, but perhaps one of the finest pianists they'd ever heard. A few older guests furrowed their brows, as if trying to match his face to a memory. Somewhere in the crowd, a retired music critic swore under his breath, convinced he had seen James on a concert stage decades ago. It was later in the evening, after most of the guests had left and the ballroom was being cleared, that the truth began to find its way to Claire. A catering staff member, a middle-aged black woman with warm eyes, found her by the coat check. "That man," she said, glancing toward James. Used to play the big stages. Carnegie Hall even. My brother had a poster of him in his bedroom when we were kids. Claire blinked. You're certain? Positive, the woman said. James Porter. Child prodigy. Trained at Juilliard. People said he was going to be the next Rubinstein. She shook her head, lowering her voice. Then his little brother got into trouble. Not real trouble. The kind they put on you when you're young, black, and in the wrong place. James walked away from everything to fight for him. Never came back. The words landed heavily. Claire glanced toward James, now stacking chairs with another staff member, his expression as serene as if he were alone. There was no trace of bitterness, no air of someone who believed the world owed him anything. She tried to imagine what it would take to give up a life like that. The lights, the acclaim, the kind of respect her mother chased at every turn. And choose instead this quiet, invisible role. It wasn't failure, it was sacrifice. Margaret emerged from a conversation nearby, catching sight of her daughter speaking to the staff. Her gaze hardened and she approached. Claire, we're leaving, she said crisply, not even acknowledging James as she passed him. But Claire's eyes stayed on him as they walked toward the exit. She felt the stirrings of something she couldn't yet name. Admiration, yes, but also an unease, as if she had just witnessed a truth about her mother's world that she couldn't unsee. And James, still working, didn't look after them. He didn't need to. The backstory. It was a week later when Claire found herself standing outside the maintenance office of her mother's corporate headquarters, unsure why she had come. She had told herself it was curiosity, but in truth, the image of James at that piano had been haunting her. She'd replayed it in her mind, note by note, wondering how such beauty could come from a man the world barely saw. She knocked softly, and his voice came from inside. Steady, unhurried. Come in. The office was small, tucked behind a service hallway, its single window looking out onto a brick wall. The space was neat but lived in. A thermos, a few paperbacks, a small framed photo of two young boys standing barefoot in front of a weathered porch. James was seated at a desk, repairing a lamp with a set of worn tools. Claire stepped inside, the hum of the fluorescent light overhead the only sound for a moment. I wanted to thank you, she began, for what you played the other night. And, to understand. James set the lamp aside and gestured toward a chair. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he waited, letting her decide how much she wanted to know. I heard you were a prodigy, she said finally. He smiled faintly, the kind that held both pride and a hint of sorrow. I was a kid who loved the piano. Some folks decided that meant I had a gift. I got into Juilliard on a scholarship when I was 17. Played my first concert tour before I was 21. Claire could almost see it. The bright lights, the packed halls, the young man with the same steady hands she'd seen at the gala. What happened? His eyes drifted toward the framed photo on the desk. My little brother Marcus. He was 18 when they arrested him, said he was involved in a robbery. He wasn't, but we didn't have the kind of money or the kind of lawyer it takes to make the truth matter. The words were matter of fact, but his voice carried an undertow of years-old ache. I stopped touring, picked up whatever work I could to help with his case. Custodial work was steady, paid enough to send to the lawyers. Every time I thought we were close, there was another delay, another appeal. Claire's throat tightened. Did it work? Did they release him? James leaned back, his gaze distant. No. He died in prison 3 years ago. The air between them seemed to grow heavier. Claire searched for words, but none felt worthy. James saved her from trying. I never went back to the stage, he said. Didn't seem right. Music. It became something I played for myself. For peace. For him. There was no self-pity in his tone. Only a quiet acceptance, the kind that came from years of carrying a weight no one could lift. Claire felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Grief for the brother she had never met. Anger at a system she had never been forced to see up close, and a deep, humbling respect for the man in front of her. You could have been, she started, but trailed off. James finished it for her. I could have been someone people recognized, someone with my name in the papers. He shrugged gently. But this way, I can be someone who's still here. And sometimes, that's enough. For the first time, Claire noticed the small upright piano pushed against the wall in the corner of the office. Its surface was scratched, and a stack of sheet music sat on top, worn from years of use. She wondered how many nights he had sat there alone, playing for no one but himself and a memory. She left the office that day feeling different, as though a door she hadn't known existed had been opened inside her. And on the other side was a truth she could not ignore: the daughter's stand. Claire had grown up in a world where image was everything, where her mother's approval was currency, and her own place in society was carefully curated like the guest list of one of Margaret Ellison's galas. But after her conversation with James, something inside her began to resist that world's rules. She started visiting the maintenance office in the afternoons, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with sheet music. James didn't make it easy, not because he was unkind, but because he treated her no differently than anyone else. There were no indulgences, no special favors. If she wanted to learn, she had to earn it. The first time she sat at his upright piano, her hands trembled slightly on the keys. She had studied under accomplished teachers before, but this was different. James didn't hover over her or correct every mistake. He listened. When she faltered, he asked her what she heard, not what she played. "You're thinking too much about how it looks," he told her once, as she stumbled over a phrase. "Music isn't a performance until it's honest. Until then, it's just notes." Those sessions became the highlight of her week. She found herself lingering after work, ignoring the raised eyebrows from her colleagues. Slowly her playing began to shift, less polished perhaps but richer, freer. When Margaret found out, the reaction was swift. It happened over dinner at the Ellison penthouse, the kind of meal where each course arrived under a silver dome. Claire had barely sat down when her mother's voice cut through the clink of cutlery. "I hear you've been spending time with the janitor," Margaret said, her tone laced with disdain. "His name is James Porter," Claire replied evenly. Margaret set her wine glass down with deliberate precision. "You can't possibly think that's appropriate. You have a reputation to maintain. People talk." "Let them," Claire said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "If they're going to talk, at least let it be about something worth listening to." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "You're throwing away opportunities for, what? Some charity project?" "It's not charity," Claire said, her voice rising. "He's teaching me more about music and about life than anyone else ever has, and you humiliated him in front of everyone for no reason." Margaret leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You're being sentimental. This is not how the real world works." Claire pushed her plate away. "Then maybe the real world needs to change." The words hung in the air like a challenge neither of them knew how to meet. Over the following weeks, Claire and James began working on a shared idea: a charity concert to raise funds for music programs in underserved schools. It was James's suggestion, but Claire took it and ran with it, calling in favors, securing a venue, designing a program that would blend classical works with pieces by overlooked black composers. The planning sessions were a mix of practicality and quiet revelation. James shared stories of the musicians he had met in his youth, some of whom had vanished from the public eye because the world didn't make space for them. Claire began to see not just the music, but the silences between the notes, the lives unplayed. Every time she told her mother about the concert, Margaret changed the subject. But Claire noticed that she didn't forbid it outright. That perhaps was its own small victory, the true proposal. The charity concert hall buzzed with quiet anticipation, a subtle energy pulsing through the crowd that had gathered on a crisp spring evening. The venue was intimate but elegant. Soft amber lights cast gentle shadows over a packed audience made up of supporters, music lovers, and curious newcomers drawn by the promise of something rare: music born of resilience and hope. Claire stood backstage, the weight of months of planning resting lightly on her shoulders. Her gown was simple but striking, a deep emerald green that shimmered under the dim lights. Next to her, James adjusted the cuffs of his dark jacket, a quiet steadiness in his movements. He wore no uniform tonight, only the dignified air of a man who had earned his place here not by title, but by talent and character. As the first notes of the opening piece floated through the hall, Claire felt a calm wash over her. This was no longer about proving anything to Margaret or the elite who had once dismissed James. It was about reclaiming stories, voices long silenced by circumstance, and shining a light on the power of music to heal and unite. Midway through the program, Claire and James took the stage together for a duet, a seamless blend of piano and voice that wove through Chopin's familiar melodies, infusing them with newfound depth. The audience was silent, held captive by the unmistakable truth in their performance. Backstage, Margaret watched from a small private box, her expression unreadable. She had come reluctantly, pulled by a mixture of curiosity and a desire to witness what she had once scoffed at. But as the music rose and fell, as Claire's voice soared and James's fingers danced across the keys, something in her shifted. She realized too late that her arrogance had nearly cost her a partnership that transcended wealth and status. There was no proposal tonight in the way she had once mocked. No contract to sign, no alliance to be brokered. Instead, there was respect, a quiet recognition that some bonds are forged not in privilege, but in shared passion and mutual honor. When the final note faded, the hall erupted into a standing ovation. Claire and James exchanged a glance, one of gratitude, understanding, and a bond that would endure far beyond the spotlight. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Claire found James by the piano. She smiled, feeling the weight of everything that had come before lighten just a little. "I don't need a proposal," James said softly. "But I accept friendship. Collaboration. Whatever comes next." Claire nodded, her heart full. The night outside was quiet, the city lights sparkling in silent applause. And inside, a new story had begun. One where dignity, talent, and resilience were measured not by paycheck or title, but by the courage to rise beyond silence.